Hey friends, it's Pastor Joe. Great to be with you today. A grandfather was showing his grandson some of his old comic books. The 10-year-old grandson was just fascinated by a picture of Clark Kent turning into Superman in a phone booth. And the young kid just keeps staring in disbelief at the picture. And the grandfather asks him, well, what is it? Have you never seen a Clark Kent before? Or is it that you've never seen Superman before? James starts chapter 5 by talking about a harsh punishment for those who've done evil. And I think that as we're listening to what James is talking about here, it's easy for us to think that he's talking about someone else other than ourselves. You see, we look at James chapter 5 and we don't recognize ourselves. We say to ourselves, we don't act like that. We don't look like that. The question is, or do we? See, James is speaking to the rich. And some of what he's saying is addressing the rich that were taking advantage of the poor and exploiting them. But even more than that, he's also talking to us that are well off and that focus too much on the riches. See, we think of it as just blessings, but those blessings can be distractions when they take the focus off of God. So in James chapter 5, verse 1, it says this: "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you." Whew, that's harsh. And then he continues on. "Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver has rusted, and their rust will be evidence against you." James is talking to the people that have hoarded wealth and that are using their resources only to benefit themselves. And it's interesting, usually if a person dies who's gotten a whole lot of money, other people will look at them and say, oh my gosh, look at how blessed they were. But James here in James chapter 5, he's saying, no, it's not that that's going to be such a blessing, but if it's used in the wrong way, instead of it being a blessing, it will be evidence used against you. In other words, your assets suddenly become liabilities. Well, when I read this in James chapter 5, I immediately thought of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Jesus tells a parable, and he's telling a parable about a rich man who was dressed in fine clothes and who had plenty to eat. And then he also talks about a man named Lazarus, not Lazarus, Mary and Martha's brother, but another Lazarus who's a poor man. And every day this poor man just goes to the gates of the rich man, and his one desire is to eat the crumbs that fall off the rich man's table. Well, what happens is both Lazarus and the rich man die, and the rich man goes to hell. And Lazarus, the poor man, he goes to the bosom of Abraham, which is kind of like heaven. And from hell, the rich man says, send Lazarus to come down and quench my thirst, just to put some drops of water on my tongue. And Abraham says, no, you had so much in your life. You had all of this. And Lazarus, or the rich man, says, well, if you can't have him come to quench my thirst, send him back to my family to warn them. And it's interesting because that's what James is doing right now. James is warning us about the focus of our lives. James is warning us to recognize ourselves, and that sometimes instead of helping others, all we do is heap up things for ourselves. Remember in James chapter 1, verse 27, James talks about what our true purpose should be when it comes to religion and the wealth that we have. He says true religion includes taking care of the orphans and the widows. Then in James 2, verse 15, he asks, what does it profit if your brother is cold and hungry and you say to him, go in peace, be hungry and well fed, but you don't do anything to help? You think you're blessed, but if you don't use those blessings in the right way, then it becomes a liability against you. Our blessings were never meant to be stored up. They were meant to be shared and to help others. In James 5, he goes on to say that you have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. And the imagery is like a pig, right? And this pig just keeps getting fed. And the more it's getting fed, it just eats and eats and eats. And the pig is probably thinking to himself, man, I got it made here. Look at all this food. Eating it all up. Never realizing that he's on the way to the market to be slaughtered, right? We think we've got so much, but those things, when we're not generous with them, can get in the way of our relationship with others, and it can get in the way of our relationship with God. James 5:5 goes on to say, you have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You've lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. And I think the real question becomes, who are we living for? Are we living for Christ? Are we focused on the needs of others? Or are we simply living for ourselves? The question is, who do we belong to? 1 Corinthians 6:20 says, you are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So here's a question for you. Here's a big thought for you today. Do you recognize yourself as someone living for Christ? When others look at you and look at your life, do they recognize someone living for Christ? Or are you simply living for yourself? And if so, what do you need to change? What do you need to do in order to align yourself and your possessions and your actions and your attitudes with who you really are? A grandfather was showing his grandson some of his old comic books, and the 10-year-old was fascinated by a picture of Clark Kent turning into Superman in a phone booth. He just kept staring at the pages in disbelief. And the grandfather asked him, what is it? What's got you so amazed? Is it that you've never seen Superman before, or you've never seen a Clark Kent? And the 10-year-old stared in wide eyes, and he said, no, it's not that. It's just that I've never seen a phone booth before. I think it's hard to recognize ourselves in these verses. But James is warning us to take a closer look. And it don't take X-ray vision to see the places where we put too much emphasis on our own riches. Friends, we have been blessed to be a blessing unto others. Amen. Amen. God bless you.